The rain had just begun to fall as I sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. It was one of those quiet afternoons where time seemed to stretch endlessly, the kind that made me question whether I was living my life or simply existing in it. My neighbor's laughter drifted over the fence, light, carefree, and impossibly distant from the storm brewing inside me. I've been feeling stuck lately, caught between who I was and who I wanted to be. The weight of unspoken desires pressed heavily against my chest, like a secret too big for its container. IT wasn't unusual for their voices to carry into my space. We lived close enough that walls felt more like suggestions than barriers. But today, something about the tone of his voice caught my attention. Not hers, her boyfriend, Alex. He spoke with a warmth that could thaw even the coldest heart, yet there was an edge to his words, a subtle tremor that hinted at unease. I strained to hear more, not out of nosiness, but because there was something undeniably magnetic about him. When he appeared at my door later that evening, soaked through despite the brief walk from his house to mine, I didn't know what to expect. His dark hair clung to his forehead, water dripping onto the collar of his shirt, and his hazel eyes darted around nervously before settling on me. "Hey," he said softly, almost hesitantly, as though unsure if he should have come at all. I need your help." His request was simple enough. A favor involving some paperwork he'd misplaced, nothing extraordinary. Yet the way he lingered after explaining himself told me this wasn't just about lost documents. There was a vulnerability in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, in the way his fingers fidgeted with the hem of his jacket. Something deeper lurked beneath the surface, something he wasn't ready to say outright. And maybe that's why I agreed so readily to uncover the mystery, or perhaps because I couldn't resist the pull of someone so obviously in need of understanding as we sat together at my kitchen table. Sorting through papers under the soft glow of overhead lights, I found myself stealing glances at him when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet intensity to Alex, a sense of restrained energy that made every movement deliberate, every word carefully chosen. When he laughed, a rare occurrence during our task, it startled me how genuine it sounded, how it transformed his entire face. For a moment, I forgot my own troubles, distracted by the enigma sitting across from me. But then came the pause, the shift in atmosphere that changed everything. He stopped mid-sentence, staring down at the paper in his hands as though it held answers to questions he hadn't dared ask. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you should know," he began, and the air between us grew thick with anticipation. Whatever he was about to reveal, I knew instinctively, would leave me speechless and irrevocably alter the course of both our lives. Little did I know, this rainy afternoon would mark the beginning of a journey neither of us could have predicted. A journey filled with longing, discovery, and secrets that refused to stay buried. As Alex opened up, piece by guarded piece, I realized this wasn't just his story, it was becoming mine too. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Alex finally spoke again. His voice, softer now, carried a weight that made me lean in unconsciously. "I need to tell you something," he said, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper in front of him. "But I'm not sure where to start." He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. There was fear in his eyes, fear of judgment, of rejection, but also a flicker of hope, as though he believed I might understand. "You can start anywhere," I replied gently, trying to mask the curiosity bubbling beneath my calm exterior. "I'm listening." He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping back to the table. "It's about us, about who I am." The pause that followed felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "I've been hiding something, not just from you, but from everyone. From myself, even." His confession hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I waited, letting him gather his thoughts, sensing that this was a moment too fragile to rush. Finally, he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush, as though he feared losing his nerve. "I'm not straight. Not entirely, anyway. and it's tearing me apart. The room seemed to shrink around us. The hum of the refrigerator and the patter of rain outside fading into the background. All I could focus on was Alex, his trembling hands, the way his shoulders hunched slightly as if bracing for impact, the raw honesty in his voice. It wasn't just the revelation itself that struck me. It was the courage it must have taken to say those words aloud. To someone like me. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and take his hand to offer reassurance or comfort. But another part, the part burdened by my own insecurities, held me back. What did he expect from me? Was he looking for advice, validation, or simply a safe space to unload his secret? And what did this mean for us? For whatever connection we were tentatively building? I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I've spent so long pretending to be someone I'm not. My girlfriend, she has no idea. She thinks everything's fine, that I'm happy. But I'm not. I haven't been for a while. His words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were shocking. I'd known people in similar situations before, but because of the way they resonated with my own struggles. How many times had I hidden parts of myself, afraid of what others might think? How often had I silenced my desires, convincing myself that wanting more was selfish or wrong? You don't have to figure it all out right now, I said eventually, my voice steadier than I felt. Sometimes just saying it out loud is enough. Alex nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. Thanks for listening, he murmured. I didn't think anyone would understand. We sat in silence for a while after that, the tension between us shifting subtly. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but charged with uncertainty, with possibility. As much as I wanted to help him, to ease the burden he clearly carried, I couldn't ignore the stirring within myself. There was something undeniably compelling about Alex, something that went beyond sympathy or empathy. It was attraction, plain and simple, though I wasn't ready to admit it, not even to myself. Over the next few days, our interactions became more frequent, almost instinctively. Whether it was borrowing sugar or discussing neighborhood gossip, Alex found reasons to stop by my place. Each visit left me more conflicted than the last. On one hand, I enjoyed his company. There was an ease between us, a natural rhythm that felt rare and precious. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience. What was I doing, encouraging this closeness when I knew it could only lead to complications? One afternoon, as we stood in my driveway, chatting about nothing in particular, Alex turned to me suddenly, his expression serious. Can I ask you something? He said, his tone hesitant. Do you ever feel like you're living two different lives? Like there's the person everyone sees, and then there's the real you, locked away somewhere no one can find? His question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it mirrored my own thoughts so perfectly. For years, I'd hidden behind a mask of normalcy, afraid of standing out or drawing attention to the parts of myself I deemed unacceptable. Hearing Alex articulate those same fears made me realize how deeply we were connected, not just in this moment, but in our shared experience of feeling unseen. Yeah, I admitted quietly. All the time. He let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair. I guess that makes two of us. There was a beat of silence, during which neither of us moved. Then, without warning, Alex stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His proximity sent a jolt through my body, every nerve ending sparking with awareness. I don't want to hide anymore, he whispered, his eyes searching mine. But I'm scared, scared of losing everything and everyone I care about. Before I could respond, he pulled back slightly, shaking his head as if to clear it. Sorry, he muttered, taking a step away. That was probably too much. No, I said quickly, surprising even myself with the urgency in my voice. It wasn't too much. You deserve to feel safe, to be honest about who you are, even if it's hard. Our eyes met again, and in that moment something shifted. The barrier between us cracked, revealing a glimpse of what could be. A connection deeper than friendship, stronger than fear. But as quickly as it appeared, reality reasserted itself. Alex glanced toward his house, where his girlfriend's car was parked in the driveway. The reminder of her presence loomed large, casting a shadow over the fragile bond we were forging. I should go, he said reluctantly, though he made no move to leave. Thank you for everything. As he walked away, I couldn't help but wonder how long either of us could keep pretending. The pull between us was undeniable, but so were the obstacles standing in our way. Still, as I watched him disappear into his home, I realized something important. Alex's secret had changed more than just him. It had awakened something in me, too. A longing I'd buried deep inside. A desire for connection that refused to stay silent any longer. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and fleeting encounters. Alex seemed to find excuses to linger in my orbit, whether it was asking for gardening tips or borrowing tools he didn't really need. Each interaction felt like stepping into uncharted territory, where the air crackled with an undercurrent of possibility. Yet neither of us dared to cross the invisible line we'd drawn between us, a boundary defined by fear, circumstance, and the weight of secrets. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Alex appeared at my door again, this time carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. "Peace offering," he said with a sheepish grin, holding one out to me. "I figured you could use a break from your usual instant stuff." I laughed despite myself, taking the cup from him. The warmth seeped through the cardboard sleeve, grounding me in the moment. "You're not wrong," I admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," he replied, shrugging casually. "Just thought it'd be nice to sit outside for a bit. Unless you've got better plans?" I hesitated for only a second before shaking my head. "No plans. Let's go." We settled on the porch steps, side by side, but not quite touching. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hum of a passing car. For a while, we sipped our coffee in companionable silence, watching as the stars began to the darkening sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and yet there was an undeniable tension simmering beneath the surface. "This is nice," Alex said eventually, his voice soft enough that I almost missed it. "I don't get to do this often. Just sit and breathe without thinking about everything else." "Yeah," I agreed, turning my head slightly to look at him. In the dim light, his features were softer, more open. There was no trace of the guardedness I'd seen during our earlier conversations, just a quiet vulnerability that made my chest ache. "It's easy to forget how important moments like these are." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Moments like these remind me of who I used to be, before all the pretending started." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to pry open the layers of his past, and understand the person he had been before life forced him into hiding. But instead, I stayed silent, letting him speak, or not, at his own pace. After a long pause, he continued, his tone lighter now. "You know, I used to love stargazing when I was younger. My dad would take me out to this field near our house, and we'd lie on a blanket for hours, pointing out constellations. He always said the stars reminded him of possibilities, like anything could happen if you believed hard enough." "That's beautiful," I murmured, struck by the image. "Do you still believe that? About possibilities, I mean?" Alex tilted his head, considering the question. "Some days, yeah. Other days, it feels like the world has already decided what's possible for me. Like I'm stuck playing a role I didn't audition for." His honesty caught me off guard, stirring something deep within me. It wasn't just pity I felt for him, it was recognition. Recognition of the same suffocating constraints I'd placed on myself, the same longing for freedom I'd buried beneath years of self-denial. "You're not alone in feeling that way," I said quietly, my fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "Sometimes it feels like the hardest part isn't figuring out who you are. It's finding the courage to let other people see it." He turned to look at me then, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "Do you ever feel like you're close to breaking free?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like maybe, just maybe, you could step out of the shadows and into the light." The question hit me like a punch to the gut, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I wanted to say yes, to tell him that I was brave enough to embrace who I truly was. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the faint glow of fireflies dancing in the yard. I think about it, I admitted finally. But wanting something and actually doing it are two very different things. Alex nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I get that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions that neither of us was ready to articulate. Then, as if sensing the heaviness of the conversation, Alex broke the spell with a playful nudge to my shoulder. Hey, remember that time you tried to fix my lawnmower and ended up breaking it worse? I groaned, covering my face with my hands. Don't remind me. You still owe me for that repair bill. Fair point, he conceded with a laugh. But in my defense, you should have known better than to trust me with power tools. Our laughter mingled in the cool night air, easing some of the tension that had built between us. It was moments like these, light and effortless, that reminded me why I enjoyed his company so much. Beneath the weight of his struggles, Alex was kind, funny, and endlessly charming. Being around him felt like coming home to a place I hadn't realized I'd been missing. As the weeks passed, our connection deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. We spent more time together, exploring shared interests and discovering new ones. One Saturday morning, Alex showed up at my door with a sketch pad and a mischievous grin. Art lesson, he announced, waving the supplies triumphantly. You're officially my first student. I don't know about this, I protested, eyeing the materials skeptically. I haven't drawn anything since kindergarten. All the more reason to try, he countered, grabbing my wrist and pulling me toward the living room. Come on, live a little. Besides, I promise not to judge your stick figures. Reluctantly, I gave in, allowing him to guide me through the basics of shading and perspective. At first, I was self-conscious, convinced that my attempts were laughably bad. But Alex's encouragement was relentless, his praise genuine even when my lines wobbled or my proportions were off. By the end of the session, I found myself laughing at my own mistakes, marveling at how freeing it felt to create without fear of perfection. You're a natural, Alex teased, flipping through the pages of my sketchbook. Look at this one, abstract genius. I snatched the book back, rolling my eyes. Abstract disaster, maybe. Same thing, he quipped, nudging me playfully. See, told you it'd be fun. And it was. More than fun, actually, it was exhilarating. Every shared activity, every inside joke brought us closer together, blurring the lines between friendship and something more. But with each step forward came a fresh wave of doubt. Was I leading him on? Was I being selfish, indulging in feelings I couldn't act on? The questions haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my happiness point one night. After a particularly long conversation about dreams and regrets, Alex leaned back on the couch, his expression unusually serious. Can I ask you something? He said, his voice low and hesitant. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? My heart skipped a beat, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Different how? He hesitated, his gaze flickering to mine before dropping to his lap. If we weren't, well, if we didn't have to hide, if we could just be. The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between us charged with unspoken longing. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I answer a question I didn't fully understand myself? Yes, I wondered, constantly, but saying it aloud felt dangerous, like lighting a match in a room full of dry tinder. Instead, I reached out tentatively, brushing my fingers against his. The contact sent a jolt through me, electric and undeniable. Alex froze, his breath hitching audibly. For a moment, neither of us moved, suspended in the fragile balance between restraint and surrender. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through mine. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. It wasn't a declaration or a promise. It was simply a gesture, small but profound, that spoke volumes about the emotions we both struggled to name. We can't, I whispered, my voice trembling. Not yet. I know, he replied, squeezing my hand gently. But someday maybe. Someday. The word lingered in the air, fragile and hopeful, like a seed planted in uncertain soil. As we sat there, hands intertwined, I allowed myself to imagine what that future might look like. A world where we didn't have to hide, where love wasn't weighed down by fear or shame. It was a beautiful dream, but for now, it remained just that, a dream. It was a stormy night, the kind where lightning split the sky in jagged streaks and thunder rolled like an angry drumbeat. I've been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as rain battered my windows. Sleep eluded me, not because of the weather, but because of the weight pressing on my chest, a mix of longing, guilt, and fear that had become unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex's face, his hesitant smile, the way his hand had lingered in mine just days before. The memory of that touch still burned, a quiet reminder of how close we were crossing a line neither of us could take back. And then there was a knock at the door, soft but insistent, cutting through the cacophony of the storm outside. My heart leapt into my throat. Who would be out here at this hour? I padded barefoot to the door, pulling it open cautiously. There he stood, drenched from head to toe, his dark hair plastered to his forehead and his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling rapidly as though he'd run all the way here. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the relentless patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. "Alex," I finally managed, my voice barely audible over the storm. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking water from his arms like a stray dog. His movements were frantic, almost desperate, as if he couldn't decide whether to stay or flee. When he finally turned to face me, his expression stopped me cold. His hazel eyes were wild with emotion, fear, determination, and something else I couldn't quite name. "I couldn't stay away," he said hoarsely, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I tried, but I can't keep pretending anymore. Not with you." My stomach dropped. This wasn't just another late-night visit. This was something bigger, heavier, something irreversible. "What are you saying?" I asked, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm saying," he hesitated, running a trembling hand through his soaked hair. "I'm saying I don't want to hide what I feel anymore. Not from myself, and definitely not from you." The air between us crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close and tell him everything would be okay. But I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, paralyzing me with the knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything. "You know we can't do this," I said, my voice strained. "You're with her. You have a life, responsibilities, and none of it feels real," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "Don't you get it? None of it matters if I'm not being true to who I am. To us." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of me. Us. He'd said it aloud, given shape to the thing we'd both been dancing around for weeks. It terrified me, not because I didn't want it, but because I did, so badly. "Alex," I started, but he cut me off again, stepping closer until there was no space left between us. "No," he said firmly, his hands gripping my shoulders. "No more excuses. No more hiding. Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll walk away right now. I swear I will." His grip was firm but trembling, betraying the vulnerability beneath his bravado. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face in sharp relief. In that split second, I saw everything: the pain, the hope, the raw need. And I knew I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. "I feel it," I admitted, my voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "God help me, I feel it." Before I could say anything else, his lips crashed against mine. The kiss was fierce, almost desperate, as though he'd been holding back for years and could no longer contain himself. My knees nearly buckled beneath me, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. His hand slid up to cup my face, his fingers threading through my hair, anchoring me to the moment. For a few glorious seconds, nothing else existed. No stormy, no secretis, no consequences. Just him and me. Two people clinging to each other like lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for air, reality came rushing back in waves. Alex rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "We can't go back now," he whispered, his voice ragged with emotion. "Do you understand that?" I nodded, unable to form words. Of course I understood. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a declaration, a promise, a leap into the unknown. Whatever happened next, we were bound together now, for better or worse. But even as the euphoria settled into something quieter, darker thoughts began to creep in. What about her? What about the life Alex had built? The expectations placed upon him? Could we really navigate the fallout of this moment without destroying everything and everyone in our path? As if sensing my unease, Alex tightened his hold on me, pulling me closer. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, his voice steadier now. "Together, together." The word echoed in my mind, equal parts comforting and terrifying. Because while I believed him, I had to believe him, I also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Secrets like ours had a way of unraveling, often in ways we couldn't predict or control. Still, in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of his body pressed against mine, the sound of his heartbeat syncing with my own. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The morning after the storm arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in pale golden streaks, casting long shadows across the room. I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside, their cheerful melodies a stark contrast to the heaviness settling over me. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that last night had been a dream, a vivid, intoxicating fantasy born of loneliness and longing. But then I felt it, the faint scent of Alex lingering on my pillow, mingling with the faint musk of rain-soaked sheets. It wasn't a dream. Every detail, the desperation in his kiss, the weight of his body against mine, the whispered promises we'd made, was achingly real. And now, reality was knocking at the door, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. That I found Alex in the kitchen, standing by the window with a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and shadowed, but there was a quiet resolve in his posture that hadn't been there before. When he turned to face me, his expression softened slightly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the turmoil beneath. "Morning," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep, or maybe nerves. "How are you holding up?" The question caught me off guard. How was I holding up? My mind raced with fragmented thoughts, each one more overwhelming than the last. What had we done? What would happen next? Could we really keep this secret from everyone, including her? I don't know, I admitted, sinking into a chair at the table. "This feels impossible." Alex nodded slowly, setting his mug down before pulling out the chair across from me. "It's going to be hard," he acknowledged, his tone measured but tinged with sadness. "But running away isn't an option anymore. Not for me." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Running away. That's what he'd been doing for years, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, burying his true self under layers of pretense. But now, after everything that had happened between us, retreat no longer seemed possible. The dam had broken, and there was no turning back. "What about her?" I asked finally, voicing the question that had haunted me since the moment he'd walked through my door last night. "What are you going to tell her?" Alex flinched visibly, his gaze dropping to the tabletop. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep lying to her. She deserves better than that." "And what about us?" I pressed, unable to stop myself. "What happens when she finds out? Or your family? Or anyone else who might not understand?" He didn't answer right away, instead reaching across the table to take my hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, but it did little to ease the knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. "We'll figure it out," he said eventually, his grip tightening slightly. "One step at a time. But I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "That you won't push me away," he replied, his eyes searching mine. "No matter how messy things get, no matter how scared we both are, I need to know you're in this with me." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me. How could I say no to him? How could I walk away from the person who had awakened parts of me I thought were lost forever. But saying yes came with its own set of risks. Risks I wasn't sure I was prepared to take. "I'm here," I told him, squeezing his hand in return, "for however long you need me." The days that followed were a blur of heightened emotions and mounting tension. Alex began distancing himself from his girlfriend, canceling plans, and making excuses to avoid spending time with her. At first, she didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't say anything. But the cracks in their relationship were starting to show, subtle shifts in her demeanor that hinted at unease. She called him less often, her texts grew shorter, and when they did spend time together, there was an awkwardness between them that hadn't been there before. Meanwhile, our own connection deepened in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. We stole moments whenever we could, meeting in secret places where no one would see us. Empty parking lots, secluded trails, late-night diners on the outskirts of town. Each encounter left me more conflicted than the last. On one hand, being with Alex felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. On the other hand, the guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, reminding me of the pain we were causing someone who didn't deserve it. One afternoon, as we sat in my car overlooking the lake, Alex turned to me with a pained expression. "She knows something's wrong," he confessed, his voice trembling. "She asked me about it yesterday. Said I've been acting distant." My heart sank. "What did you tell her?" "That work's been stressful," he replied, shaking his head. But she didn't buy it. I could see it in her eyes. "She's smarter than I give her credit for." "So what are you going to do?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I have to tell her," he said firmly, though his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. "I can't keep living this lie. It's killing me, and it's not fair to her." The finality in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. As much as I admired his courage, I couldn't ignore the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Once the truth came out, there would be no going back. Our lives would change irrevocably, and not necessarily for the better. When the confrontation finally happened, it was worse than either of us had imagined. Alex invited her over to talk, choosing a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown, to soften the blow. I waited anxiously at home, pacing the floor and checking my phone every few minutes for updates. When the call finally came, his voice was hollow, drained of all emotion. "She took it badly," he said, his words clipped and mechanical. "She cried. A lot. Asked me if there was someone else." "And what did you say?" I prompted, bracing myself for the worst. "I told her the truth," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Not about you specifically, but enough for her to know that I'm not straight. That I've been struggling with this for a long time." There was a long pause, during which neither of us spoke. Finally, he added, "She said she needs space. Time to process everything." The relief I felt was fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Word would spread eventually, whether through her or someone else. Friends, coworkers, family members, all of them would have opinions, judgments, questions we weren't ready to answer. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout became increasingly difficult to navigate. Whispers followed us wherever we went, speculative glances exchanged behind our backs. Some people offered support, albeit cautiously. Others made their disapproval known in subtle but unmistakable ways. Through it all, Alex remained steadfast, clinging to the belief that honesty, even painful honesty, was worth the cost. But even he had moments of doubt, times when the weight of rejection and judgment threatened to crush him. During those moments, I held him close, reminding him why we'd chosen this path in the first place. Love, I realized, wasn't just about passion or desire. It was about resilience, about standing beside someone, even when the world tried to tear you apart. And so, as the dust began to settle and the initial shock gave way to a fragile new normal, I allowed myself to hope. Hope that we could weather whatever storms lay ahead. Hope that love, in all its messy, imperfect glory, would be enough to carry us through. Months passed, and the world around us slowly adjusted to the new reality we had created. It wasn't easy, far from it, but somehow, against all odds, Alex and I found a rhythm that worked. The whispers didn't disappear entirely, but they softened over time, fading into the background like static on an old radio. People moved on as people tend to do, leaving us to carve out a space where we could exist. Not perfectly, not without scars, but authentically. That Alex's ex-girlfriend eventually stopped calling altogether. At first, her silence felt heavy, like an unanswered question hanging in the air. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that she needed distance, not just from him, but from the pain of what had been lost. In her absence, Alex wrestled with guilt, replaying their relationship in his mind and wondering if he'd done enough to make things right. "You can't fix everything," I told him one evening as we sat together on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Sometimes, the best you can do is be honest, even when it hurts." He nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tracing patterns on the armrest of his chair. "I just hope she finds happiness again," he murmured. "She deserves that." "She will," I assured him, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "And so do you." The truth was, neither of us had anticipated how much this journey would change us. For Alex, it meant shedding the layers of fear and denial that had kept him trapped for so long. He began to embrace who he truly was, not just for himself, but for the sake of those who mattered most, including me. His courage inspired me to confront my own insecurities, to stop hiding behind excuses, and start living the life I'd always dreamed of but never dared to pursue. One Saturday morning, Alex showed up at my door with a picnic basket slung over his shoulder and a mischievous grin on his face. "Let's go somewhere," he said, grabbing my hand before I could protest. "Just you and me." "Where are we going?" I asked, laughing despite myself as he pulled me toward his car. "It's a surprise," he replied cryptically, tossing the basket into the back seat. "Trust me." We drove for nearly an hour, winding through narrow country roads until we reached a secluded meadow surrounded by tall oak trees. The grass was damp with dew, glistening under the pale morning light. Alex spread out a blanket in the center of the clearing and unpacked the basket, revealing an assortment of snacks and drinks he'd clearly spent hours preparing. "This is beautiful," I said, taking it all in. The gentle rustle of leaves overhead, the distant chirping of birds, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy above us. "Where did you find this place?" "I used to come here as a kid," he explained, sitting cross-legged on the blanket, "whenever I needed to think or escape for a while. It feels safe somehow." As we ate and talked, the conversation shifted naturally to the future, a topic we'd avoided for so long. "Do you ever wonder what's next for us?" Alex asked suddenly, his tone lighter than I expected. "Like, we'll be in 5 years. 10. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. The idea of planning anything beyond tomorrow still felt daunting, given everything we'd been through. But as I looked at him now, his eyes bright with curiosity, his smile warm and unguarded, I realized something important. Uncertainty didn't have to mean fear. It could also mean possibility. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, leaning back on my elbows. "But I try not to focus too much on the details. As long as we're together, I think we'll figure it out." His expression softened, and for a moment, he simply stared at me, as though committing every detail to memory. Then, without warning, he leaned forward and kissed me, a soft, lingering touch that sent warmth spreading through my chest. "What was that for?" I asked, smiling against his lips. "For believing in me," he replied simply. "For sticking by me, even when I didn't believe in myself." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, though I blinked them away quickly. "You saved me too, you know," I said quietly. "Before you, I was just surviving. Now, I feel like I'm finally living." We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, letting the weight of the past dissolve into the peacefulness of the present. By the time we packed up and headed home, the sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As we drove back, Alex reached over and took my hand, lacing our fingers together like it was the most natural thing in the world. That in the weeks that followed, small moments like these became our anchor. We weren't perfect. We argued, doubted, stumbled, but we faced each challenge together, drawing strength from the bond we'd fought so hard to build. Slowly but surely, We began to step out of the shadows, no longer afraid of being seen. Alex started introducing me to his friends as the person who makes me happiest, and though some reactions were mixed, he stood firm, refusing to apologize for loving openly. For my part, I learned to let go of the need for control, to trust that love, real, messy, imperfect love, was worth the risk. I stopped waiting for permission to be happy and instead gave myself permission to dream again. Together, we built a life that felt authentic, even if it wasn't always easy. Done on a crisp autumn evening, as we walked hand in hand through the park near my house, Alex stopped suddenly and turned to face me. Do you remember that night, the stormy one, when everything changed? Of course I remember, I said, smiling at the memory. How could I forget? Well, he paused, his expression turning serious. That night, I made a promise to myself to fight for us no matter what. And now, looking back, I realize how far we've come, how much stronger we are because of everything we've been through. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't bother wiping them away. We're survivors, I said softly. Both of us. He nodded, pulling me into a tight embrace. And whatever happens next, he whispered, his voice steady and sure, we'll survive that too. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. Life would always have its challenges, its uncertainties, its storms. But as long as we had each other, I knew we could weather anything. Because love isn't about finding perfection, it's about finding someone who sees your flaws and chooses you anyway. Someone who reminds you, even on your darkest days, that you are enough. And in Alex, I had found exactly that.